Our next speaker is Professor Adison Marques. Dr. Marques is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Human Kinetics, University of Lisbon, Portugal. He was a physical education teacher and coach in Scholar Sports program. His main research interest is the study of health promotion, correlates of physical activity, fitness and physical education. He has published more than 100 international peer-reviewed original articles and has been an investigator in several research projects. He's a reviewer of several scientific journals in the fields of sports science and health promotion. For 6 years, he was member of the board of the Portuguese Society of Physical Education, and he is assistant director for the National Physical Activity Promotion program at the Portuguese Ministry of Health. Today, the topic of his presentation is prevalence of physical activity among adolescents from 105 different countries. So I'm honored to announce Professor Marques. It's your turn.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for being here with you. This is a different program, because not a program, but a different way for us to be together. In fact, we are together, but we are not together. But fortunately, the Congress was not postponed, and it is my pleasure being here with you today. So for today, I will share my screen. So the idea is for us to talk about the prevalence of physical activity among adolescents. So this is the topics that I brought here for us to speak a little bit today. We know that physical activity is a very important health behavior. So among children and adolescents, we know that physical activity is related with lots of biomarkers of health. It has a significant impact on cardiovascular, bone, and metabolic health, and it also improves the physical fitness of adolescents. It is good for the weight status, and it is so very important for the quality of the sleep. So therefore, because of this and many others health benefits of physical activity on health, we can conclude that promoting physical activity, it is important for public health. Because of that, we have been hearing lots of messages saying that physical activity should be promoted, and it is important for the adolescents, for the children, youth to be active, to engage in physical activity every single day. We know that for sure, and this is the message that we try to share with the society. Focus on the kids. We know that physical activity is important for everybody, but for today, our focus, it is on the adolescents. So in spite of this knowledge that we have and we're trying to share, it is curious to see that most of adolescents, they do not practice enough physical activity to improve their health. We are saying that they do not practice enough physical activity to achieve the recommendations of the World Health Organization, which is to practice at least 60 minutes of physical activity at moderate to vigorous intensity every day. So I'm showing you perhaps the last published studies that they prove that clearly. So we are talking about two different studies that were published this year, one with accelerometers and the other one with self-report information. But these two studies, they show exactly the same, that around 80% of the adolescents all over the world, they do not practice enough physical activity to fulfill the recommendations. I will present some figures for us to understand this more clearly. So this is the first study. The data were collected by questionnaire. So kids, they report their physical activity. And when we look at the data, when the data are stratified by the level of income of the countries, so we can see that the results are pretty the same. There are not big differences. And we can see that 80%, around 80% of the adolescents, they do not engage in enough physical activity. So when we look at the data, but we have a different look, we are looking at the data by regions in this second graphic, we can see that the variance here, it is much bigger than the previous figure, but at the end, we can say that the results are all pretty the same. So we are seeing data that's showing us that most of adolescents are not active enough. So looking at the different data collected in this case by accelerometers, which is, I would say, more reliable because it is a way to assess physical activity directly, we can see that most of adolescents, they do not engage in enough physical activity to fulfill the recommendation. So this is the message that we can see in lots of papers, in lots of research that has been doing. So we can conclude that despite the benefits of physical activity, adolescents are physically inactive, basically. So this is the message, but looking at these two papers, we realize that the focus is put on the amount of adolescents that do not engage in enough physical activity. So we can see that these papers, they just dichotomize the information, those who achieve the recommendations and those who do not achieve the recommendation. So we know that those who achieve, it is a group, it is a very solid group. So, but this, we believe that we should not put in the same bag all the kids. Why? Because here we have an adolescent that engage at least 5 times a week in physical activity, but we have here in the same bag one other adolescent that do not engage in physical activity, never. We thought that this is not a good way to present information, and we should look at these two groups. But when we are looking at this group, the group that adolescents do not achieve the recommendation, we have to split, we have to open this group and have a different look. So because of that, because we believe that it is important to know the levels of physical activity, even the levels of those who do not fulfill the recommendation, we decide to perform this study. So the aim of this study was using a huge amount of data, looking the data worldwide. The main goal was to analyze the prevalence of physical activity participation according to its frequency in adolescents age 11 to 17 years old. So this is a cross-sectional study with adolescents, and we try to collect data from the adolescents all over the world. So for that, we collect data from representative national samples, and we use data that are from different surveys. So we use health behavior in school-age children. Most of the European countries that are part of the investigation are from this survey. We use also global school-based student health survey, and then we made a different search to trying to get more data from particular countries. For instance, from the United States, we use health risk behavior surveillance. From Brazil, Pesquisa Nacional de Saúde do Escolar, and from Mexico, Encuesta Nacional de Salud y Nutrición. So as you can see, we collect data from several different surveys, and we put all of this information together. It is important here to mention that it was possible because the question that were used in every single survey to assess physical activity, it is exactly the same. Because of that, it was possible for us to merge all of this information in one database. So it is also important here to say that lots of these data are the same that were present in one of the papers that I showed you before, the paper that was published in Lancet. The difference was that they present data that were collected in the last 19 years. So we decide only to use data that were collected in the last 10 years. It means that our sample it is much shorter, but we decided to use this criteria. So the final sample was a little bit more than 500,000 adolescents. You can see boys and girls. The name is very similar from more than 100 countries. And here we can also see the regions. I do believe that most of us that are here today are from Central and Eastern Europe and high-income Western countries. This is the different regions that we use to analyze the data. So the data were self-reported, as we said before, and adolescents, they report the number of days that they engage in physical activity in at least 60 minutes per day. So for us, it is an indicator of the amount of physical activity that they have. And
Adison Marques?
And it is possible for us to see if they achieve or they do not achieve the recommendations. So answers were given on a 8-point scale from 0 to 7. 7 means that they engage in physical activity every day, and 0, they never engage in physical activity during the week. So this is the methods that we use. Looking at the results, we can see here some interesting things. So the previous studies that I present you, they dichotomize. They look at the adolescents that practice physical activity every day, and they look at the others, and they put all of them in the same bag, as I said before. And we believe that it is important not to analyze the other adolescents that do not fulfill the recommendations as a whole. So we must have a different look, because when we look at this data, we can see that unfortunately almost 70%, we can say 20% achieve the recommendations. Okay, but 80%, more than 80%, they do not achieve. Okay, but we can see that almost 18% of boys and 14% of girls, they do not fulfill the recommendation, but we have to say that they are relatively active, because they are involved in physical activity 5 to 6 times per week. And I think this is important, because when we decide to promote physical activity among these adolescents, it is different if we decide to promote physical activity among those in the left part of the figure who never engage in physical activity. So it means that it is important for us to have this picture, because we are talking about different profiles. And the previous studies, they did not show these different profiles. And unfortunately, only a small number of adolescents fulfill the recommendation, but we can say that those who engage 3 or more times per week are a group that we should put some attention, because we can say that this is a group of kids that they practice physical activity. Perhaps they like to practice physical activity. They like to be involved. It means that perhaps they need a small push. They need a small motivation, because we can see that they already practice some activity. So with those, it has to be different, because they really need to start. We have to win the inertia, which is sometimes very difficult. Looking at the data according to age, we will not analyze every single detail, but we can take a look to the right line. The red line represents those who engage 0 up to 2 times a week physical activity, at least 60 minutes. When we look at the red line, we can see that it increases with age. It means that as age increases, the number of adolescents that do not practice physical activity increase, which is something negative for us. On the other hand, those who engage in physical activity every day, it means those who fulfill the recommendation, we can see that the numbers, they decrease from 28% at the age of 11 and 12 to 21% at the age of 16 to 17 years old. It means that we are seeing a decrease. Perhaps we can conclude that lots of things have to be done, mainly among older adolescents, because this particular group of adolescents are the ones that are at risk. Looking at the growth, the tendency it's very similar. The numbers are different, but we can see exactly the same pattern. As age increases, the number of girls that do not engage in physical activity or engage 1 or 2 times per week increase significantly. So we can see that it increased more than 30%. On the other hand, those who engage in physical activity every day, the number decreased from 90.4% to 11.1%. So the results of girls and boys and girls, the pattern, it is very, very similar. It means that older adolescents is a group at risk, and we have to look at this group and put our attention and our efforts. According to the Human Development Index, looking to the boys from data from boys, here, if we look at the group that's engaged in physical activity every day, we can say that there is no big differences. The results are pretty similar. So, which is good, not the numbers, but the absence of discrepancies, of differences. However, when we look at the group that's engaged in physical activity maximum 2 times per week, here we can see a huge difference. Adolescents from countries with the lower Human Development Index, we can see that most of them are in this group. So it is a cause of concern, because this group of adolescents, perhaps they do not have the same facilities, they do not have money, and we know that lots of activities we have to pay. So I would say that if we have to decide what is the target group for us to intervene, I would say that the adolescents from the countries with the lower Human Development Index. And this is very clear for the boys. However, for the girls, the results are a bit different. So here, we cannot see differences when we are looking at the left part of the figure among those who are from the country with lower, middle, and high income. So only girls from the very high Human Development Index, we can see differences when we compare with the others. We are looking at the left part of the figure. So it led us to conclude that the Human Development Index, which is an indicator that we can use to see education and the income of the countries, we can see that adolescents, they have different levels of physical activity. So the idea is to provide opportunity for all adolescents to engage in physical activity every single day in at least 60 minutes of physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity. However, we can see here that this is not happening, and perhaps the level of Human Development Index, which reflect the education and the income of the country, it is a determinant of the levels of physical activity. So this is one of the last figure, I think it is the last one. I decide to put here the data from some countries. I took the country with the higher levels of physical activity and the lower level of physical activity. They could be outliers. I look at the data and I can assure you that they were not outliers, but just in case, I took them from this figure and I put some of the countries from the different parts of the spectrum. And here it is interesting for us to see that, for instance, look at the Finland, the country that it is at the bottom of the figure. We can say that almost 60%, I think this is important to mention, almost 60% of adolescents in Finland, they engage in physical activity in at least 5 times per week, which is very good. However, when we look at the other extreme of the figure, Timor-Leste, we would say that only around 10% engage in physical activity 5 or more times per week. So this is a huge discrepancy that we can see here among countries. The average is here. It means that perhaps the opportunities are very different, the access to the facilities are very different, or perhaps the programs to promote physical activity among adolescents are very different among countries. I would say that this is a big cause of concern because we are talking about physical activity, which is a health behavior, and it is expected that all adolescents, they engage in enough physical activity every single day. However, this figure and this result show that the countries or the region or the human development of the country, they might be a determinant, but they should not be a determinant because it is expected that every single adolescent engage in enough physical activity to fulfill the recommendations. So this is the results that we have and that we would like to show you with you. To conclude, we can say that most adolescents engage in physical activity up to 3 times. Unfortunately, this is not what we would like to see because only a bit more than 17% engage in physical activity every single day. The prevalence of engaging in physical activity every day decrease over the age. So this was very clear for boys, this was very clear for girls. It means that as they are getting older, their levels of physical activity decrease. And this is a very important aspect that we have looked upon because we have trying to change this tendency. And for boys and girls who engage in physical activity 5 to 6 times per week, this is a mistake. The prevalence increased from countries with the lowest human development index to countries with the highest. So as we can see here, this is like a picture of the levels of physical activity in lots of countries, and we have to conclude that it is not a beautiful picture. Lots of things have to be done, and we, physical educator promoters, we really have to work to change this very ugly picture. So this is what I have for us today. Thank you for your attention. This is my contact. You can contact me, feel free for doing so. Thank you for the opportunity for being here with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the presentation, Professor Marques. It was kind of like related with the Gregor's presentation, to be honest, kind of like following study. Because as far as I can remember, in the Gregor's presentation, in the Gregor's study, they mostly focus on the children, and now you focus on the adolescents. So it's pretty good, like, and the way of the presentations are perfectly scheduled. This is what I can say. And now I would like to ask the audience if they have any question first. And I also have like a couple of questions, in fact, Professor Marques. So it's like kind of like very promising that, so apart from the low like income level, also kind of the pictures that you showed us is also related to the educational level of the country. So when the educational level of the country getting improved, the physical activity level also improved. Because to my knowledge, I know that the Finland is the most, the best, they have the best educational level in the world, as far as I know. So they also like the most active country in the world also. So there must be some relationship with the education also. And the other thing that I would like to point out, in fact, this was the contribution, but the question, my question is, so okay, we have to focus on the low income countries to get the adolescents more active, but how about the age level? You know, is there kind of like a threshold when the adolescents being like more active than being more inactive? Is that kind of like adolescence in some, you know, age period, they start to decrease the activity level?
Well, thank you for the questions. Yes, I agree with you. And look at the data. We stratified the data by country, so it was not possible here to present all of the countries. But what you said, it was very clear, because the level of the education was also related with the level of physical activity. We do not know for sure, but we believe that this might happen because of the level of education. It is also related with information, with the knowledge that we have. And perhaps some of these countries, they really believe that it is important to promote physical activity with the knowledge for the kids, but also for the parents. They really understand the importance of promoting physical activity among kids. And this is something that we only can speculate, because the data did not allow us to conclude that. But I would say that perhaps most of these countries, they really promote physical activity, and they do it also promoting the knowledge of the importance of the physical activity for the health benefits. The second question about the thresholds, in this study was not possible to see, but in other studies that we are involved, we could see that 10, 11, 12 years old, the results of the levels of physical activity are pretty high. But then we can see a decrease. In most countries, when the kids, when they are 13 years old, they move to a different schools. It happens. Perhaps also it is related with different interests that the adolescents start to have. Yeah. Some of them, they start to date, others start to be more involved in the new technologies, and they spend more time in their electronic devices. There are lots of explanations, but the threshold, most of the studies, they show that it is between 12 and 13 years old. We can say that it is when they are getting out from the childhood and they are getting in the adolescence. I think this is the threshold.
Thank you, Adison. And we have a question from Professor Bozic.
Yes.
Boja.
Thank you, Professor Marques, for great presentations. I also performed some similar research in Serbia, and I find the similar results that you present today. My questions to you is how can we change this negative trend that our children became overactive as the age? for example, adolescent with higher age, as I'm right, as I see in your graphs, are overactive than younger children. And what mechanisms are developed in countries with high human development index that changed it, that negative trend?
Well, thank you for the question, Professor. This is, I think, the $1 million question. It is not very easy to answer, but what we can see is that it is not easy, because this is like a tendency. As you said, you collect data from Serbia, but the pattern, it is pretty the same. So we can see that all over the world. However, there are some cases that I would say that they should be study cases. The example of Finland. We know that Finland, it is well known because of the higher levels of physical activity of its population. And once I was reading a paper, and this paper was comparing the physical activity policies in GDR, German from the West, the Western German, and Finland. And the paper for me was very, very interesting, because the idea was to ask the people, the population, how they see physical activity, and if they percept that they can have access to the facilities. And it was very interesting to see that people from Finland, they report that physical activity, it is very important for health. And they also report that they have the perception that they have enough facilities, and the facilities are open for them to use. The people from GDR, from the Eastern German, they report exactly the opposite. They had the perception that the facilities were only for an elite of athletes. They have no access, and they said that it was not a social message important for the people to engage in physical activity. So of course we know that these answers, some of them, they could not be true, but for me it was interesting to see that the countries, the leaders, the physical activity promoters, they have to share this message. The idea is that this message is around the society, and then I really believe that it can become a social norm. So the people will start to engage in physical activity because this is what we have to do. And this is happening in some countries, but very slowly, very, very slowly. For instance, in Portugal, 10 years ago, only a small number of people used to run outside. Today, this number of runners, it is increasing. Why? Because today it is like a social norm for us to go out and use the parks to do physical activity. I really believe that we have to spread this message in such a way that in time this will be a social norm. But this is just a thought. There is no a straight answer. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Adison. Thank you. We have, thank you, Professor Bozic, for your question. We have another question from Professor Spasic, Miodrag Spasic.
Yes, I wanted to ask Professor Marques something about problems of inactivity. So we always detecting inactivity as a medical problem related to some physical condition. And my question is, do you have any information? Is there still like that huge number of maybe inactivity is related still with huge number of problems regarding to inactivity? My question is about can you tell me something about maybe evolution? Are we starting to be more more resistant to inactivity? Because
Yes,
the way of life in the whole world, the way of life is inactivity, mostly related to computers and sitting, sedentary way of living. So is there still a relation, or we try to beat that problem? Thank you.
well, thank you for the question. This is a very acute question, in fact. So this data do not allow us to answer properly this question. However, other studies, they show us that the levels of physical inactivity, it is not for sure related with some health problems or diseases. It is only a lifestyle. There is no correlation with physical problems and physical inactive, because we perform some other studies using only healthy adolescents, and the results are always the same. Most of adolescents, they do not engage in enough physical activity, and we are talking about adolescents with no health problems. I would say that this is only a lifestyle, and perhaps because the studies, they dichotomize those who do not achieve and those who achieve the recommendation. I think the papers should not dichotomize this way, because imagine an adolescent that they are involved in a sport competition and they have the practice 3 times a week and they have the game at the weekends. We would say that they engage in physical activity 4 to 5 times per week. Because the papers, they dichotomize the level of physical activity, engage and not engage in enough physical activity to fulfill the recommendation. These particular kids that I'm using for an example, they would be in the group of those who are not physically active. And I think this is the problem. In fact, these kids, they do not practice enough to fulfill the recommendation. But we also have to admit that this kid, they practice some activity. He is not the same as the other who do not practice non-activity. So I think this is a problem of the study, but answer straight to your question, there is no relationship between the levels of physical inactivity and the health problems. There is no correlation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Spasic, for your question. And I think we have to thank you, Professor Marques, for your great presentation. I think you also triggered most of the audience attention. So I would like to thank you again. And then we have to continue